The dinner rush at Mama Rosa's. The scent of garlic, slow-simmered tomatoes, and fresh basil hung heavy and sweet in the air, a fragrant embrace that was Mama Rosa's signature. Tonight the kitchen was a symphony of controlled chaos. Pans sizzled, steam billowed from massive pots of pasta, and the rhythmic thud of a chef's knife against a cutting board provided a percussive beat. Chef Leo, a man whose quiet presence belied his immense skill, navigated the maelstrom with an almost preternatural calm. His eyes, keen and perpetually observant, darted from the bubbling marinara to the perfectly golden focaccia emerging from the oven. "Table 7 needs their calamari, pronto," a server called, her voice strained over the din. Leo merely nodded, his movements fluid as he plated a generous portion, the crispy rings glistening under the heat lamp. He moved with the grace of a seasoned conductor, his team of cooks and prep staff responding to his unspoken cues. He might have been a quiet man, but his authority in this kitchen was absolute, built on years of dedication and an unwavering commitment to quality. He always said, "Food is love, and love deserves your best." Outside the kitchen's swinging doors, the restaurant was filling quickly. Laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation. Then a sudden hush fell, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the dining room like a cold front. Leo, accustomed to the kitchen's cacophony, felt the shift immediately. He paused, a half-finished plate of ossobuco in his hand, and peered through the small, greasy window in the door. A hulking figure filled the entryway, his expensive suit stretched taut across a formidable frame. Mr. Big. He wasn't just a regular, he was a force of nature, a silent promise of trouble and prosperity in equal measure. Behind him, 2 men, equally imposing, scanned the room with a practiced intensity that chilled the air. One, Big Tony, was a brick wall of a man with eyes like chipped flint, constantly sweeping the room, vigilant and unreadable. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his presence a silent threat. The other, younger and leaner, kept a hand near his jacket's lapel. The chattering of the diners resumed, but it was subdued now, laced with an undercurrent of nervous energy. Mama Rosa herself, usually a whirlwind of gregarious charm, stood frozen behind the hostess stand, a strained smile plastered on her face. Leo sighed, a barely audible puff of air. Mr. Big's visits always ratcheted up the tension, transforming Mama Rosa's cozy trattoria into a stage for something far more complex than a simple dinner. He turned back to his station, his hands meticulously arranging a garnish. Just then the swinging doors burst open, and a young man stumbled backward, his arms flailing. Marco, the new busboy, looked like a deer caught in headlights. A stack of linen napkins, folded with painstaking care just moments before, scattered across the grimy kitchen floor like fallen snow. His cheeks flushed crimson, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. He was a skinny kid, barely out of his teens, with a perpetual anxious furrow in his brow. Leo had taken a liking to him. Marco was earnest, hard-working, and carried the weight of his family's expectations on his slender shoulders. He needed this job desperately. "Marco, watch it," snapped one of the line cooks, a harried woman named Sophia. Marco mumbled an apology, bending down quickly to gather the fallen napkins, his movements clumsy and hurried. He snagged his elbow on a pot handle, nearly toppling a stack of clean plates. His hands trembled as he tried to scoop up the linens, his focus entirely on the immediate disaster. He didn't seem to notice the shift in the dining room, the arrival of the city's silent power. Leo watched him, a familiar pang of concern tightening in his chest. Marco was so eager to please, so desperate not to make a mistake, that he often made more of them. The kid just needed a chance, and maybe a little guidance. Leo knew what it was like to feel that crushing pressure, to feel like failure was always lurking just around the corner. He had been there himself, once upon a time. He finished plating the ossobuco, placing it gently on the pass. He glanced at Marco again, who was now sheepishly trying to refold the soiled napkins, his face still burning. Leo knew Marco's family was struggling, his mother ill, his younger siblings looking to him. This job was more than just a paycheck. It was hope. The restaurant's bell chimed, signifying a new order for the kitchen. Table 9, 2 lasagna al forno. Leo turned, his calm demeanor firmly back in place, but a new thought had taken root in his mind. A quiet worry that hummed beneath the surface of the dinner rush. He wondered how Marco would fare tonight, under the added weight of Mr. Big's formidable presence. It was going to be a long evening. A big tip and a bigger problem. The clatter of Mama Rosa's kitchen, usually a comforting symphony of culinary creation, now felt like a discordant clang against the taut silence emanating from Table 7. Chef Leo, his movements precise as he plated a dish of osso buco, felt the shift in atmosphere acutely. Mr. Big, a man whose presence filled a room like a rising tide, pushed back his chair with a soft scrape that somehow echoed through the bustling restaurant. He dabbed at his lips with a linen napkin, a gesture of almost delicate refinement that belied the hard glint in his eyes. Then, with a flourish that was both casual and deliberate, he reached into the inner pocket of his finely tailored jacket. A thick wad of bills emerged, bound with a paper band. Without a word, he peeled off several crisp green notes, each one a stark, undeniable $500. He fanned them out on the pristine white tablecloth, a verdant fan of wealth that seemed to hum with its own power. 5 of them. $2,500, left unceremoniously amidst the crumbs of his meal. A king's ransom for a dinner. Beside him, Big Tony, a man whose shoulders seemed to stretch the very fabric of his suit, didn't move an inch until his boss rose. Then, with a fluid, predatory grace, Tony stepped away from the table, not towards the exit, but slightly behind it, positioning himself so that his broad back was to the wall, his gaze sweeping across the dining room. His eyes, dark and flat like polished river stones, settled on the stack of money with an almost possessive intensity. He was a silent sentinel, a living barrier between the temptation of easy money and anyone foolish enough to consider it. The message was clear. This was not just a tip. It was a statement, and touching it without permission would be an act of profound folly. Marco, wiping down the adjacent table with a damp cloth, felt his stomach clench. The air around Table 7 had grown thick, charged with an invisible current. He'd seen the money, a small fortune lying exposed, and his breath hitched. His eyes, wide and almost childlike, darted from the green stack to Big Tony's unblinking stare, then back to the money, as if caught in a magnetic field. The damp cloth felt suddenly heavy in his hand, his movements growing stiff and awkward. He imagined the weight of those bills in his own palm, the sudden cessation of the gnawing worry that had been his constant companion since his father's accident. The thought was intoxicating, dangerous. He needed this job. Every fiber of his being screamed that he needed this job more than he needed to breathe. And yet, the temptation, the sheer audacity of so much money left unguarded, even with a human fortress standing watch, was a physical ache. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, tickling his eyebrow. He fumbled the cloth, nearly dropping it to the polished floor. From the pass, Chef Leo watched the tableau unfold. He saw the glint of avarice, quickly suppressed in Marco's eyes. He saw the almost theatrical display of wealth, and Big Tony's unwavering vigilance. A cold knot formed in the chef's gut. This wasn't just a generous tip. It was a challenge, an imposition, a test of the establishment's unspoken rules. Mr. Big wasn't just paying for his meal. He was asserting his dominance, reminding everyone in the room of his power, even in the mundane act of settling a bill. The subtle shift in the kitchen's rhythm, usually dictated by the ebb and flow of orders, was now influenced by the silent drama unfolding in the dining room. The line cooks, usually oblivious to anything beyond their sizzling pans, cast furtive glances towards Table 7. Even the usually unflappable Mama Rosa, bustling around the front of house, seemed to move with a heightened awareness, her laughter a little less robust, her smile a fraction tighter. Marco, pretending to polish an already gleaming wineglass, risked another glance. Big Tony hadn't moved. He was a statue carved from granite, his gaze fixed on the money. The busboy's mind raced, a dizzying whirl of desperate calculations. How quickly could he snatch it? How impossible would it be to escape? The answer, he knew, was instant apprehension, followed by a swift and brutal reprisal. His family's future, already teetering, would crumble. He squeezed his eyes shut for a fleeting moment, trying to dispel the image of those crisp, green rectangles. Chef Leo, his gaze still fixed on Marco, knew the boy was teetering on an invisible precipice. He could practically feel the pull of the money, the siren song of its promise, resonate through the young man. Leo wiped his hands on his apron, his jaw tight. Mr. Big and his crew were making their way to the exit, their departure as unhurried and deliberate as their entrance. Big Tony remained, a looming shadow, until the last of his entourage had passed through the heavy oak doors. Only then, with a final lingering look at the untouched stack of money, did he turn and follow, his presence receding like a fading echo. The silence that followed their exit was almost deafening, a vacuum where their imposing presence had been. But the money remained, a vibrant green beacon on the white cloth, a testament to their visit, and a new, unsettling problem for Mama Rosa's. Chef Leo knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was far from over. The wobble and the whisk. The scent of roasted garlic and oregano usually filled Marco with a comforting warmth, a familiar embrace of home. Tonight, it felt like a suffocating shroud. Each clatter of a plate, each muffled laugh from the remaining patrons, grated on his nerves. The weight of his mother's gaunt face, the silent plea in his sister's eyes as she watched him leave for work, pressed down on him, heavier than any stack of dirty dishes. His gaze, involuntary and magnetic, kept drifting back to Mr. Big's table, or rather to the small, perfectly stacked monument of greenbacks that sat upon it. $2,500. A fortune. A lifeline. Big Tony, the hulking shadow who had guarded it, was gone. Mr. Big, too, had vanished into the humid night, leaving the opulent sum as a silent, unsettling challenge. Marco's hands, usually nimble and efficient, felt clumsy, alien. He fumbled with a fresh tablecloth, the starched linen snagging on his damp fingers. His stomach clenched into a knot, a cold, hard stone of dread and temptation. His breath hitched, a shallow, ragged gasp that snagged in his throat. He was alone with the money, with its insidious whisper of salvation. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that he should just clear the table, wipe it down, and pretend the money was merely another forgotten napkin. But his feet, heavy as lead, refused to move. His eyes darted around the emptying dining room, then back to the verdant stack. It pulsed with a dangerous allure, a siren song promising an end to the crushing debt, the eviction notices, the shame. Chef Leo, from his vantage point behind the pass, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. He'd seen Marco's subtle shifts in posture, the way his shoulders hunched, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. He knew the boy was teetering on a precipice, the dazzling allure of the cash warring with a lifetime of ingrained honesty. The cold knot in Leo's gut tightened. This wasn't just a tip. It was a gauntlet thrown, a test of will and integrity designed to sow discord, to assert dominance. Marco finally moved, a jerky, almost mechanical motion. He reached for a water glass, his movements stiff and unnatural. His sleeve, too wide, too long, caught the edge of the table. A soft scrape, then a distinct wobble. Leo's eyes widened. The meticulously arranged stack of bills, so carefully placed by Big Tony, began to sway. Slowly at first, then with an accelerating momentum, like a drunken tower about to topple. It was a slow-motion disaster, a cascade of green about to scatter across the pristine white tablecloth. The sound of money hitting the floor, A rustling whisper would be deafening in the suddenly hushed room. It would be a catastrophic loss of face, a glaring failure in Mr. Big's elaborate test. Instinct, honed by years of managing chaos in the kitchen, took over. Leo didn't think. He reacted. His hand, quick as a viper, shot out from behind the pass. It moved with a blur of purpose, a practiced sweep that belied the urgency of the moment. Before the top bill could even begin its descent, his fingers had closed around the entire stack. The money, cool and crisp against his palm, was gone from the table in a single, fluid motion. Not a single bill touched the linen. Not a single rustle announced its movement. Marco, frozen in a tableau of horror and nascent relief, stared at the now empty space where the fortune had rested. His mouth hung slightly open, a silent gasp caught between his lips. Leo, his heart hammering against his ribs, pulled his hand back, the thick wad of cash clutched securely. He didn't look at Marco. He didn't look at the few remaining customers. His gaze swept the dining room, a quick, almost imperceptible reconnaissance. No one had noticed. The hushed conversations continued. The clinking of silverware resumed its gentle rhythm. The subtle threat had been averted, at least for now. But Leo knew, with chilling clarity, that this was far from over. The real game had just begun. He tucked the money into his apron pocket, the unexpected weight a tangible burden. He had made a decision, a crucial one, and its consequences were yet to be seen. A secret handoff. The crisp edges of the $100 bills, still warm from the mysterious patron's hand, pressed against Leo's palm. The air crackled with unspoken tension, thick as the simmering marinara on the stove. Marco, eyes wide and breath held, seemed frozen in a tableau of bewildered relief, the metallic scent of his fear almost palpable. Leo's gaze flickered from the discarded money on the marble table to Marco's pale face, then to the hulking silhouette of Big Tony, who was still distracted by the swirling chaos of the bustling kitchen, his back to them. A fleeting moment, a whispered decision. Without a word, Leo's hand darted out. Not to replace the money on the table, as Marco undoubtedly expected, but to deftly slide the thick wad into the deep pocket of Marco's apron. The fabric was rough against the smooth paper, a quick, almost imperceptible rustle swallowed by the clatter of plates and the hiss of the espresso machine. Marco flinched, a silent gasp escaping his lips, his eyes darting to Leo's with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The weight of the unexpected inheritance now nestled against his hip, a forbidden warmth blooming in its wake. Leo's expression remained unreadable, a mask forged from years of navigating the dangerous currents of his profession. He gave Marco a barely perceptible nod, a silent command to maintain composure, then turned back to the half-finished tiramisu, his movements fluid and practiced. The brief, illicit exchange had been executed with the precision of a seasoned pickpocket, leaving no visible trace, yet the ripple it caused was profound. Just as the last corner of the bills vanished from sight, a subtle shift in the ambient noise drew Leo's attention. Big Tony, who had been momentarily engrossed in a terse exchange with a junior cook about a misplaced order of veal, slowly turned. His massive frame, typically an immovable fixture, pivoted with a surprising grace. His eyes, usually placid and dull, were now narrowed, scanning the room with an almost predatory alertness. He hadn't seen the act, Leo was certain, but something in the atmosphere, a disruption in the force field of controlled chaos that usually defined the kitchen, had snagged his attention. Marco, still reeling from the unexpected transfer of wealth, instinctively straightened, his hands clenching at his sides. The weight in his pocket felt like a live thing, thrumming with a dangerous energy. He tried to project an air of nonchalance, but his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Had Tony seen? Did he know? The thought sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Big Tony's gaze swept over the pristine marble table, lingering for a fraction of a second where the money had been. His brow furrowed, a faint frown etching lines onto his otherwise impassive face. He seemed to be searching for something, a missing piece to an invisible puzzle. His head tilted slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, as if listening to a frequency only he could detect. The tension in the kitchen became a palpable entity, a low hum beneath the surface noise. Every clang of a pot, every shouted order seemed amplified, yet strangely muted by the watchful presence of Big Tony. Marco could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, a cold trickle down his spine. He dared not meet Tony's gaze, instead focusing on the meticulous arrangement of cutlery on a nearby table, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted a fork. Just when the silence threatened to stretch into an unbearable chasm, a voice, deep and resonant enough to rattle the very foundations of the restaurant, sliced through the air. "Tony, get over here. We have matters to discuss." It was Mr. Big. His voice, though not raised in anger, carried an undeniable authority, a command that brooked no delay. The sound was a lifeline, a sudden reprieve. Big Tony's head snapped towards the source of the voice, his moment of suspicion evaporating under the direct summons. The frown on his face deepened slightly, a fleeting expression of annoyance at the interruption, but he didn't hesitate. With one last lingering glance around the kitchen, his eyes briefly brushing over Marco without truly seeing him, Big Tony turned and lumbered towards the private dining room where Mr. Big's imperious voice had originated. The air rushed back into Marco's lungs in a ragged gasp. He leaned against the cool marble of the counter, feeling suddenly weak at the knees. The weight in his apron pocket now felt less like a burden and more like a ticking time bomb. Leo, meanwhile, continued to meticulously layer ladyfingers, his expression still carefully blank. But as he reached for the mascarpone, his fingers brushed against the porcelain bowl, and for a fleeting moment a tremor ran through his hand. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the true consequences, he knew, were only just beginning to unfold. The wink and the whisper. The dining room's incessant clatter provided a percussive backdrop to Marco's racing heart, a frantic drum against his ribs. Across the bustling kitchen, Leo, slowly polishing his hands with a pristine towel, met Marco's anxious gaze. A subtle, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of Leo's mouth blossomed into a swift, conspiratorial wink. It was a silent compact, a shared burden, a pact forged in stolen glances and simmering apprehension. A cold prickle of understanding eradicated Marco's fading relief. The money, a perilous inheritance, was now undeniably his, confirmed by Leo's fleeting gesture. Big Tony, thankfully, had redirected his attention to the dining room, his hulking frame a formidable shield against prying eyes. Marco busied himself stacking plates, his movements stiff and disjointed. Each clink of ceramic resonated like thunder, every whispered order from a passing server a direct accusation. The phantom weight of crisp $100 bills still seared his apron, a brand on his conscience. Leo's swift, precise action had averted a confrontation that would have undoubtedly ended in humiliation, if not worse. Yet this narrowly escaped disaster had birthed a new, more insidious threat. Later, as the dinner rush slowly receded, a quiet settled over the kitchen, broken only by the hiss of the last few orders and the rhythmic chug of the dishwashing machine. Marco, his shift technically concluded, lingered by the prep station, his hands instinctively fumbling with his apron strings. He surveyed the emptying space, confirming the departure of the last line cooks. The sous chef engrossed in inventory. Only Leo remained, meticulously scrubbing his stainless steel domain, the overhead lights casting a soft sheen on the polished surfaces. Drawing a deep, shaky breath, Marco untied his apron. His still trembling fingers delved into the deep pocket. The surprisingly thick stack of bills slid into his palm. The paper felt impossibly smooth, its texture alien and dangerous. He approached Leo, the money clutched tight. "Chef," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ventilation's hum. Leo paused his scrubbing, his usually sharp, focused gaze softening slightly as he turned. The deep lines around his eyes seemed to etch deeper in the harsh kitchen light. Marco unfolded his hand, revealing the illicit bounty. The hundreds fanned out, a vibrant green against his calloused skin. What am I supposed to do with this? The question was raw, laced with bewildered fear. He looked from the money to Leo, then back to the money, as if it might offer an answer. His chest felt constricted. This was not the fleeting joy of a generous tip. This was something far heavier, far more complicated. Leo leaned against the counter, his eyes scrutinizing the bills. Then Marco's pale face. He exhaled slowly, a faint wisp of steam rising in the cool air. "It's yours, Marco," he murmured, his voice low. "It came from their table. No one saw anything. No one else knows." "But it's too much," Marco stammered, the words catching in his throat. "It's not right." He felt a conflicting pull. The desperate need for the money, gnawing at him for months, battled with a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't a clean windfall. It was tainted. "Right or wrong, it's done," Leo replied, his tone firm but not unkind. He straightened, wiping his hands again, this time with a definitive motion. "And it stays done. No one, absolutely no one, breathes a word about this. Not to your family, not to your friends, not to Big Tony, and especially not to Mr. Big." His voice dropped to a near whisper on the last name, imbuing it with a chilling weight. Marco swallowed hard, the taste of fear metallic on his tongue. He gazed down at the money, its crisp edges suddenly feeling sharp, dangerous. It was a lifeline, yes, but one woven with threads of peril. The thought of paying his mother's medical bills, of buying proper shoes flickered tantalizingly, only to be overshadowed by the cold certainty that this was merely the opening move in a game he didn't understand, a game Leo had just unwillingly drawn him into. Leo's gaze was steady, unwavering, a silent warning and a shared commitment. The wink had been more than a gesture. It had been an initiation. A chance for tomorrow. The crisp bills, an alien heft, pressed a hot, illicit brand against Marco's thigh. He stood transfixed in the hushed storeroom, the familiar scent of flour and aged cheese suddenly cloying, suffocating. Leo, a carefully constructed mask of concern etched across his features, fixed Marco with an intensity that prickled his skin. "Keep it, Marco." Leo's voice, a low rumble, cleaved the silence. "Consider it a gift." Marco's head snapped up. "A gift? Chef, this isn't a gift. This is danger. I saw how those men looked at me, at the money. Big Tony's men. This isn't a gratuity from some generous diner. This is something else entirely." His voice was a strained whisper, a cold knot of fear tightening in his gut. The money's weight felt less like a boon, and more like a lead anchor dragging him down. Leo closed the distance, his shadow swallowing Marco whole. "It is what you choose to make of it. Right now, it's a lifeline, a chance. You mentioned your family, didn't you? The medical bills, the relentless struggle." Leo's gaze was unyielding, a strange blend of sternness and surprising warmth. "This money, Marco, it could be the genesis of something better for them, for you. A reprieve from the daily grind, a moment to breathe." Marco's mind reeled, a tempest of conflicting emotions. The image of his mother's weary eyes, his sister's quiet sacrifices, the ceaseless churn of debt and despair. It was a potent siren song. This staggering sum could obliterate years of worry in an instant. It could signify freedom. But at what cost? Big Tony's cold, unblinking stare flashed in his mind's eye. "But Chef, how did you obtain this?" Marco stammered, his eyes darting to the door, half expecting a hulking figure to burst in. Leo's expression hardened. "That's not the crucial point right now. What matters is what you do with it. This isn't merely about putting food on the table for a week. This is about a future. Imagine that small bakery your mother always dreamed of, or your sister's university tuition. Ambitions that felt insurmountable yesterday suddenly become tangible today. This is an opportunity for tomorrow, Marco. The words struck a deep chord within Marco, igniting a fragile flicker of hope amidst the dread. A chance for tomorrow. The very notion was intoxicating, a forbidden fruit dangled just within reach. He envisioned his mother's joy, her face illuminated by a hope she hadn't dared to entertain in years. He pictured his sister, unburdened by tuition worries, finally pursuing her dreams. I don't know, Marco mumbled, the sheer magnitude of the decision overwhelming him. You don't need to grasp every detail right now, Leo said, his voice softening imperceptibly. Yet the underlying urgency remained. Just understand this. Keep it. And keep it secret. From everyone. Marco looked at him, confusion clouding his features. Everyone? Even my family? Leo nodded slowly, his gaze hardening once more. Especially your family. And most importantly, from Mr. Big. He's the one who left the tip, remember? The one who looked directly at you as he did. He's not a man who forgets, or who gives something without expecting something in return. He placed that money there for a reason, Marco, and it wasn't out of charity. He wanted to gauge your reaction, and now he'll be watching. A shiver snaked down Marco's spine. The casual air Mr. Big had adopted, the almost benevolent smile, now seemed like a predatory mask. He had been subjected to a test without even realizing it, and Leo had intervened, had snatched the bait from the trap. He's watching, Marco repeated, the words tasting like ash. Always, Leo confirmed, his eyes betraying a deeper disquiet than he let on. And if he ever discovers you have this money, or its provenance, things will become complicated. Very complicated. For both of us. So, you must exercise extreme caution. Spend it wisely, discreetly. Avoid drawing attention. And never, under any circumstances, divulge its origin. This secret, Marco, is your shield. It's what protects you and your family. And, well, me too. The implication hung in the air, thick and stifling. Leo had put himself on the line, had entangled himself in this perilous web for Marco's sake. The gratitude that swelled in Marco's chest was tempered by a profound sense of dread. He was now bound to Leo, to this secret, to a future he hadn't chosen. I understand, Chef, Marco said, his voice barely audible. The weight in his pocket suddenly felt less like potential and more like a yoke. I won't say a word, Leo gave a curt nod, a subtle easing in his shoulders. Good. Now get back to work. Act normal. And remember, Marco, this is a chance. Don't squander it. As Marco turned to leave the storeroom, the fluorescent lights of the kitchen seemed to hum with a new, unsettling intensity. The aroma of simmering sauces, once comforting, now carried a faint undertone of something acrid, something burning. He was no longer merely a busboy. He was a keeper of dangerous secrets, a recipient of a perilous bounty, and a pawn in a game he didn't comprehend. The promise of tomorrow felt both exhilarating and terrifying, a tightrope walk over an abyss. The return of Mr. Big. A week crawled by, each day heavier than the last for Marco. The weight of the secret money, tucked away in the worn shoebox beneath his bed, pressed down on him more acutely than the stack of bills he carried in his pocket. He hadn't touched it, couldn't bring himself to. It was a phantom limb, a constant ache, a reminder of the chasm he'd stepped into. He'd seen Leo in the kitchen, a quiet nod the only acknowledgement of their shared burden. The chef seemed to move with a new, subtle tension, his usual precise movements imbued with a watchful edge. Then came the Tuesday night, a slow hum of early diners filling Mama Rosa's with the scent of garlic and simmering tomato. Marco was clearing a table near the window when a hush fell over the room. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a gradual absorption of sound, as if the air itself grew thick. He felt it before he saw it, a shift in the collective energy, a tightening in the pit of his stomach. He turned, his breath catching. Mr. Big stood framed in the arched doorway, a dark silhouette against the fading twilight. The restaurant's soft lighting seemed to dim around him, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. His eyes, the color of polished obsidian, swept over the tables, a slow, deliberate survey that left a trail of unnerved diners in its wake. Marco felt the gaze brush over him, a cold caress that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He instinctively lowered his head, busying himself with imaginary crumbs. In the kitchen, Leo felt the ripple. He was plating a tagliatelle with wild mushrooms, his knife a blur of silver. But the sudden lull, the almost imperceptible tensing of his staff, was unmistakable. He glanced up, his eyes meeting Mr. Big's through the pass. A flicker, quick as a hummingbird's wing, passed between them. A challenge? An acknowledgement? Leo couldn't tell, but his grip tightened on the plate. He placed it down with a soft clang, his jaw clenching. Mr. Big moved with an almost predatory grace, his tailored suit a second skin. He wasn't escorted, nor did he need to be. The space around him cleared naturally as he made his way to the large, round table in the corner, the same table where he'd held court the previous week. His usual entourage followed, a silent, imposing shadow. They settled around him, creating an impenetrable wall of expensive fabric and watchful eyes. Marco, still pretending to wipe down the same spot on the table, risked another glance. Mr. Big hadn't looked at him again. The man was focused, his eyes now scanning the menu, though Marco doubted he truly needed to read it. He knew what he wanted, always did. The nervousness in the dining room persisted, a low hum beneath the forced cheerfulness of the staff. Waiters moved a little faster, their smiles a little tighter. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed subdued. Leo, however, had regained his composure, at least outwardly. He barked an order to a line cook, his voice steady, but Marco noticed the subtle tremor in his hand as he reached for a fresh basil leaf. Then Mr. Big looked up from his menu. His gaze went directly to the kitchen pass, piercing through the steam and the frantic energy. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even gesture grandly. He simply held Leo's eyes, and then, with a slow, deliberate curl of his index finger, he beckoned. The invitation hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Marco watched, his heart hammering against his ribs as Leo's shoulders squared. The chef wiped his hands on a pristine towel, a ritualistic gesture before facing a challenge. He removed his apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter, as if preparing for a formal audience. Then, without another word to his bustling kitchen staff, he walked out from behind the stainless steel sanctuary, his chef's whites a stark contrast to the dim lighting of the dining room. Every eye in Mama Rosa's followed Leo's silent procession. He moved with a practiced calm, a man walking into a storm he knew was coming. He reached Mr. Big's table, the air growing thick with unspoken tension. Marco held his breath, fearing what might unfold. Leo stood there, not quite at attention, but definitely respectful, awaiting Mr. Big's command. Mr. Big's lips, usually set in a stern line, curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Chef Leo," he rumbled, his voice surprisingly soft, yet it carried an undeniable weight. "A pleasure to see you again." The words were polite, but the intensity in his eyes was anything but. It was a predator's gaze, assessing, measuring. "Join me." He gestured to the empty chair beside him, an invitation that was undeniably in order. Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, with a slight nod, he pulled out the chair and sat down, directly across from Mr. Big's most formidable bodyguard. Marco, hidden behind a tall potted plant, felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. The game had begun. A subtle dance, Mr. Big's gaze, usually a casual sweep that dismissed his surroundings, sharpened on Leo. The restaurant, typically a symphony of clinking cutlery and hushed conversations, seemed to hold its breath. Marco, stationed near the kitchen's swinging door, felt the shift in atmosphere like a physical pressure. He kept his head down, polishing an already gleaming water glass, but his ears strained, every nerve ending alert. The memory of the money, heavy and illicit in his pocket, was a hot coal against his thigh. "Everything in order, chef?" Mr. Big's voice was low, a rumble that vibrated through the polished floorboards. He leaned back, just perceptibly, in his chair, his eyes dark and unblinking, fixed on Leo. It wasn't a question of the food, Marco knew. It was a question about the missing tip, about the unspoken transaction that had taken place moments before. Leo, wiping his hands on a clean towel, met the stare without flinching. A bead of sweat traced a path down Marco's temple, but Leo's expression remained unreadable, a chef's mask honed by years of managing chaos in a hot kitchen. "Perfectly, Mr. Big," Leo replied, his voice a calm counterpoint to the underlying tension. He gestured subtly towards the dining room. "The lamb, I trust, was to your liking?" Mr. Big's lips, thin and bloodless, curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The lamb was exquisite, as always, but I confess, chef, I was curious about another matter." He paused, letting the silence stretch, filling it with unspoken implications. His glance, a shared understanding, Mr. Big pushed back from the table, a movement that seemed to ripple through the entire dining room. The clink of his expensive silverware against the porcelain plate was the only sound for a moment, an abrupt punctuation mark on the tense exchange. Big Tony, a silent sentinel throughout the meal, mirrored his boss's motion, rising with a fluid grace that belied his massive frame. Marco, still hovering near the kitchen entrance, felt his own muscles coil, a primal instinct to brace for an unknown impact. "The meal was adequate, chef," Mr. Big finally said, his voice a low rumble that carried an undercurrent Marco couldn't quite decipher. Adequate. The word, usually a slight, felt like a concession, a strange form of approval from a man who rarely offered anything so benign. He reached into the inner pocket of his impeccably tailored jacket, withdrawing a slim leather wallet. Marco's eyes, despite himself, flickered to it, a phantom sensation of the thick stack of bills still burning a hole in his own apron pocket. Instead of the ostentatious display of the previous night, Mr. Big extracted a single $20 bill. He placed it neatly under the edge of his water glass, a gesture so ordinary it felt jarring after the opulence that had preceded it. It was a regular tip, a sum utterly unremarkable in its normalcy, yet it screamed volumes. It was a statement, a calculated move designed to re-establish a different kind of order, a public dismissal of the unspoken transaction that had just taken place. Leo, his expression still a mask of professional calm, inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, sir. We hope to see you again soon." The words were standard restaurant pleasantries, but the air around them thrummed with unspoken meanings. Mr. Big didn't reply directly to Leo's invitation. His gaze, however, shifted, bypassing the pristine white tablecloths and the hushed conversations of other diners. It landed squarely on Leo's eyes, holding for a beat that stretched into an eternity. There was a depth in that look, a complex tapestry woven with threads of warning, acknowledgement, and something else. A grudging respect, perhaps, or a silent recognition of a shared understanding. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a definitive declaration, a final, unyielding punctuation to their silent negotiation. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he turned and walked towards the exit. Big Tony, a formidable shadow at his heels. The moment Mr. Big's broad back disappeared through the arched doorway, the collective tension in the dining room seemed to exhale. The clatter of cutlery resumed with renewed vigor, the murmur of conversation rising a notch. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted, though for Marco, the weight had only shifted, settling deeper into his own consciousness. Leo remained motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the now empty table. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. His eyes found Marco's across the bustling expanse of the dining room. There was no need for words, no overt signal. Their eyes met, locking for a silent, potent second. In that shared glance, Marco saw it all reflected. The audacity of Leo's act, the dangerous ripple effect it had set in motion, and the profound, irreversible change it had brought to Marco's own life. There was a flicker of concern in Leo's gaze, an unspoken question about the burden Marco now carried. But beneath that, Marco detected something else, a strange sense of camaraderie, a bond forged in the crucible of a shared, dangerous secret. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. The silent understanding was a palpable force, connecting them across the linoleum floor and the chattering diners. Marco felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The $20 bill Mr. Big had left felt insignificant, a mere wisp of smoke compared to the solid weight of the $500 in his pocket. That money, illicit and dangerous as its origins might be, represented something tangible, something real. It wasn't a dream or a wish. It was potential, a sudden, unexpected inheritance from a world he had never known existed. A new surge of energy coursed through him. He no longer felt like the invisible busboy, lost in the rhythm of clearing plates and refilling water glasses. He was a participant, an unwitting player in a game with stakes he was only beginning to comprehend. The uncertainty was terrifying, but it was also electrifying. He pushed off from the doorframe, a newfound resolve squaring his shoulders. The stack of dirty dishes on a nearby table seemed less daunting, the endless cycle of clearing and resetting less monotonous. He moved with a renewed purpose, his movements sharper, more efficient. The future, once a hazy, unreachable horizon, now glimmered with a tantalizing, if perilous, promise. He didn't know how he would navigate this new landscape, but one thing was certain. He would not be the same Marco. The $500, a dangerous seed planted in his pocket, had already begun to sprout, pushing him towards a destiny he could never have imagined. He had a secret, a heavy one, but also a ticket, a chance to build something better, to escape the crushing weight of his parents' debts, to finally look forward. The fear lingered, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now tempered by a surprising, almost defiant courage.